A new documentary is about to be released called The Message of the Lyrebird. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the producer-director of the film, Mark Pearce, and the director of photography, Nick Hayward. Welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Thank you for having us, Peter. It's exciting being here.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Great to talk to you.
It is. It's a very pleasure.
It's wonderful. And Mark, I remember the last time we spoke was about Pilliga Rising, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. We're a year older now, Peter, since we last spoke.
So tell me about the journey you've taken to make this documentary about the lyrebird.
Yeah, sure. I guess I've got to start with the relationship that Nick and I had when we first met. And Nick and I were creating educational films. And, we'd been working together for about a year or so. And we both, chatting between projects of, we should do something. And it was Nick's idea to go and film the lyrebird, because he had an experience which I'll let him talk about previously, many years before. And so we thought we were just going to create some sort of local short film to start with. It's a little film because the lyrebird was only 30 kilometres away from us where we lived in Melbourne. And it all started from there. It was very experimental. We started with no script at all. And here we are 11 years later, as I realised throughout the process of meeting birding enthusiasts and lyrebird experts that, the film was going to involve a lot more than just making a local little film about the lyrebird. There was a lot of, I guess, misconceptions about the lyrebird, and also there was lots of gaps in the natural history of the lyrebird since it was last filmed as a feature film. The last film was The Kingdom of the Lyrebird, and that was filmed in 1985. And so it was 35 years. This year it's 35 years. Back then it was around about 25 years since anything had been done on the lyrebird. And we felt that, the ABC weren't going to do it because the natural history department closed down around about the same time we started this film. So we got together, started filming, and as I say, here we are 11 years later. Now I know why there hasn't been a documentary made for 35 years on the lyrebird. It's very exhausting.
I can imagine. Nick, this is so interesting because you filmed the lyrebird for Richard Attenborough's Life of Birds. And that must have been quite an experience at that time.
Yes, and it was... that was back in the 90s, and basically they contacted me and they wanted me to go and film a lyrebird mimicking a chainsaw, that kind of thing, because they'd heard about that. Many people had told them that lyrebirds regularly mimic chainsaws. And as a contract cameraman, I said, well, where do I go to do that? And they said, well, we'll send you to Hillsville. So off I went to Hillsville and filmed. At that point, I didn't know very much about lyrebirds. And I went and filmed the lyrebird mimicking the chainsaw and the car alarm. Now that's in wildlife filmmaking, you regularly film things in zoos that are hard to film in the wild, but that's supposed to represent behaviour that actually occurs or is representation of real behaviour. And what I didn't realise is that little bit of filming would become immensely popular. So when David Attenborough turned 80, the British public voted it as their favourite Attenborough moment of all time. And if you look on YouTube, I looked this morning, so one site that has 25 million views and another site it has 11 million views. So adding that up, that's over 30 million views on YouTube. Now, what I didn't know, and I learned afterwards when I learned a bit more about lyrebirds, is that there is actually no recording of a wild lyrebird mimicking a chainsaw. I encourage your readers your listeners, to write in if they've got one. But I've never heard one, and I don't think Mark's heard one, and we haven't come across one. So what really concerned me was I'd filmed something which millions of people around the world had seen, and it defined for them lyrebird behaviour, but didn't really represent real wild lyrebird behaviour. So initially when Mark and I spoke, we thought, well, let's go out and film this chainsawing lyrebird, because there must be one out there. Everyone tells us that they chainsaw constantly. So that was the initial quest. But what we learned on the journey, that the journey and the message of the lyrebird is much more than it chainsawing. And whether it chainsaws or not actually became irrelevant to our quest to uncover the narrative in the film.
And I found that quite incredible, that it's able to mimic so many sounds, and it seems multiple voice boxes or something to resonate different sounds and then to evoke them. It was really quite remarkable, I thought.
You want to explain that, Mark? Because you've got that very well in the film. How does that work?
Yeah. Well, the lyrebird has actually a less complex syrinx. And by the way, I'm no scientist on this, but we interviewed scientists right throughout the film, and they do explain it. And there is a sequence in the film about the syrinx, which is the voice box of the lyrebird, and it's actually less complex than other songbirds. Most birds have up to 6 pairs in the voice box, the actual syrinx part. So so interesting enough, it's less complex, but as you say, it can mimic up to, well, we don't know how many sounds all at once or different sounds, but what we do know is that we believe that it can mimic a mob of flocking birds. So they call it a flocking mob of birds. So there's many different species involved in that all at once, all at one time.
It can also mimic birds coming towards you and flying away, the sound of them coming towards you and moving away. So that, and of course, they can, the wild lyrebirds have a huge repertoire of all the birds that they mimic. As Mark says, they can mimic a flock of birds, so more than one bird at once, which is quite remarkable. But that bird in captivity, which I filmed, it did also mimic all the human sounds, the car alarm and the chainsaw and the camera shut and those kind of things, which they don't do in the wild. But it demonstrates to you their ability to they could mimic anything that they put their brains to.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. I learned so much from the documentary about the lyrebird. Nick, I must ask you, it must be so painstaking to be a wildlife cinematographer, photographer, and to be patient and to get the right shots and to be able to process that. You must have enormous patience to be able to do all that filming.
Well, the lyrebird is particularly difficult to film because the lyrebird season, when they're mating and when they're doing all their mimicry and they're displaying, is in winter, and it's in the cold, wet eucalypt forests of southeastern Australia. So you need to be out in winter when it's freezing cold. You need to be in a forest which is in winter when it's raining and wet, and where the whole forest is wet. So there's a lot of mud, there's a lot of leeches. And you need to really be in there at dawn, ideally, because if you get in there at dawn, you can identify where the lyrebirds are and which part of the forest they're in. And then they don't live in a paddock, they live in a dense rainforest full of sassafras and tree ferns, blanket leaves and all these kind of rainforest plants, and fallen logs and fallen trees and thick vegetation. So you have to walk through the forest with your heavy camera gear, climbing over all these obstacles. And the only really way to film a lyrebird is to follow it. So if you sit in a mound and wait for it to go to that mound, it'll choose never to visit that mound. But if you find a lyrebird that's happy for you to follow you around, you can follow it around the forest with your heavy camera equipment. But of course, the lyrebird is much more nimble than you are with your camera equipment. But if it decides to soar from a perching branch 200 meters down through the forest, it'll land on a mound displaying, and it'll take you a good 15 minutes to clamber in there over all the logs and everything else. By the time you get there, it's finished. And the same thing, even if it just runs along the ground. It can be feeding in one particular area, and then all of a sudden it'll dash off into the forest to a mount to display. And again, you're climbing over logs and clambering over things to try and get into the position. So you can spend whole days in the forest with getting very little outcome. And one of the reasons why the Message of the Lyrebird is so beautiful of a national history film is that both Mark and I, nobody was paying us to make this film. We crazily went off to do it off our own backs. But that meant we could be obsessed and we could spend as much time as we liked on these actions. So really, I would hate to add up the number of days I spent in the forest of the Lyrebird, but it probably adds to a couple of months. I've got a diary, I should count them all up. And it was just weeks of time to go out to get, because the footage is remarkable in the film, and I don't think anybody else will ever get the same kind of footage because they won't be crazy enough to spend the same amount of time. They certainly wouldn't get it if somebody was paying them, because even David Attenborough wouldn't want to pay me to spend that amount of time in the forest.
Yes, and I think I said Richard Attenborough before. I did mean David Attenborough. So. but how remarkable that is, and the patience you have to exhibit. So, Mark, I'm quite intrigued. Tell me about the process then of getting the interviews, of fashioning this feature documentary, because there is so much detail in the program, in what you reveal.
Yeah, sure. Well, as I say, it was a very organic process. We started filming with the Sherbrooke Lyrebird Survey Group, or the study group as they're now called. And, we started off filming dawn surveys, which shows the audience, how people observe lyrebirds and learn to protect them and understand where the male territories are. And so we started, and they were painstaking. They were getting up at 4 a.m. in the morning, arriving at the site and filming the whole process. And we multicammed that with a crew of about, I think, 6 of us at one stage. So that was some of the more complex stuff to do in the dark, because as I say, you're waking up quite early and then you arrive and you're talking to total strangers in the dark, and when it starts to become light, you start to see the fog coming out of your mouth. It was quite cold in the mornings, and so we started to really build a relationship with the study group, and of course they had many connections all over the East Coast of the different experts, and I guess one expert led to the next, and that's when I came to realise that we needed to show more than just one perspective of not just the question of do lyrebirds imitate sounds of human origin, but just to really understand the science behind it. And we've also got the Indigenous story behind the lyrebird in there, and the sound recording of the lyrebird. So there's a whole array of different perspectives, and we felt that was the way to go, to have a multi-character story, because there are, as I said at the beginning of this interview, that there are so many misunderstandings and misconceptions of what the lyrebird is and what it can do in the wild. So Nick and I travelled, up the East Coast. We filmed in Canberra. Nick filmed all over the Gippsland areas, and we filmed up in the Blue Mountains, as well as obviously the Dandenongs and Sherbrooke Forest, where a lot of the filming takes place, of the natural history of the lyrebird. But I guess, in the end, it was really decided that we needed this multi-perspective understanding of the lyrebird, because, as I say, the Indigenous perspective, gives us another deep insight into, what the lyrebird actually is, and where it came from, and then that that contrasts with a lot of the science in the film as well. So it was very, very diverse, and I think that's that was the key, the diverse range of human cultural and philosophical domains on the actual lyrebird itself. And importantly, it shows, you know, the lyrebird's survival is inextricably connected with our humanity. So I thought that was very important to get that message across as well. It is you know, the people and the bird and the people who love the lyrebird, and this gives us I guess another insight into the subculture, the Australian subculture of birding enthusiasts, which was, you know, very I'd never really been or understood the birding culture until we made this film. But yeah, it was quite interesting for me to get that across, because it's another Australian perspective of who we are, and yeah, I found the birding culture, you know, quite an extraordinary bunch.
I can imagine that they would be interesting. and Mark, and Mark, I also like the way you've used some animation in the documentary, and the use of music, and, as you say, the Indigenous perspective as well. So that really adds so much, I think, to the quality of the documentary.
Yeah, absolutely. Bernadette Trans-Thiedemann, she did the Indigenous story, which is named Yandallara, and that gives us, as I said before, a deep insight into how the lyrebird came to be, as well as their understanding of it being the interpreter of all languages. And again, you know, the film does touch on this diversity of language, and obviously that's the key to the lyrebird. And yeah, I think the animation, as you say, it really does just add quality to the. You know, we didn't have a Hollywood budget to animate every frame for that particular Indigenous story, because it's a 6-minute story, and it was all independently produced. But I think the beauty of the actual design and artistry that Bernadette's done is just, yeah, I was just over the moon at you know, when she first showed me the initial pictures, and so I think we you know, it's important for the audience to look at those images, as well as, you know, let Auntie Fran, who is the Dharawal knowledge holder of the story, let the audience just really take in you know, her storytelling as she drives the story.
Sure. Tell me about the editing process, because Mark, you and Nick must have sat down and decided which shots of the lyrebirds would be used, and how it would sequence in terms of the storytelling, and so on. That must have been quite an interesting process.
Yes, it was. And just before I do get into the editing, I should also mention, because you touched on the animation side. We had Victor Dreamholder. Obviously, he is an amazing designer who I work with, and he does a whole lot of other sequences, like the ancient lyrebird sequence, and you'll see you know, a combination of very old and new techniques used in the film, in his animation, and again, his beautiful design. And yeah, again, I was just stoked with how all of that came out. We worked 3 months on it together, he and I, in the early part of this year, to get what we finished with. So I just wanted to make note and acknowledge Victor, an incredible man who I've worked with for 20 years now. So yeah, onto the editing. We originally did a trailer back in, filmed for about a year, and I put a trailer together to try and get some funding as a pitch trailer in 2011, I think it was. And so I guess I didn't do a lot of editing back then, but I had a full understanding of a year's worth of footage, which was, you know, many hours of footage which we'd already gathered, that Nick had filmed. So I'd had a bit of an idea where the story was going at that point. And mind you, we hadn't filmed half the amount of interviews that we had back then, but that just gave me I guess an overview of where I wanted to go with the story itself. And obviously that developed and over time, and then a main edit was completed in 2017 after we got much of the other footage. And in fact, 80% of it had been shot up until that point, and we filmed the last 20% of it just in the last, from this time last year up until about February, early this year. But yeah, so yeah, the main edit was done in 2017, and I guess there was about 80% of it completed by that point. So, which wasn't a very far direction from the original 2-minute trailer that we did in 2011. It was really about trying to tell the story, the two narrative through lines, which is the sounds of human origin, and obviously the important aspects of the lyrebird, which is its mating and its dance rituals. And so these two through lines come together in the climax, as you'll see in the film. So yeah, it was really about showing the audience, bringing together those two through lines for audiences to follow.
Well, it works really well. I was very impressed and learned a great deal from the documentary. So, what's the next step in the process? I mean, how will the film be released?
Yes, well, we're in talks and have been in talks and got a lot of host screenings, environmental organisations, birding organisations to host screen the film. Obviously, when we can get out of this thing called COVID, because we've been trying to, bring the idea of having, live screenings in cinemas and community spaces is, the idea of that is to bring communities together, as well as, I guess, raise funds for these communities and bring awareness to each campaign, because this isn't focused specifically on one campaign at all. It's obviously about the lyrebird and its habitat ultimately, and the continuation of life. So those things together can bring a broad range of organisations together to get it out there to audiences. So that's the initial stage or rollout of the documentary. We'd like to do that over the next 6 months, and at the same time it's running through the film festival circuit. So we've got a world premiere in New York at the World Conservation Film Festival the festival itself runs from October 18 to 24, I believe. So it's hitting New York, and we've got it into another festival, Nature Without Borders, also in the States on the East Coast there. So we're slowly, as most independent films, happen, they take a lot longer than a Hollywood film to distribute, but we'll slowly roll it out over the next 6 months, and then we'll look to an educational version of the film, probably towards the end of next year. And yeah, well, I mean, obviously, if networks are interested, there'll probably be a network version as well. We'll see how that goes. This is definitely the festival version, as it runs 77 minutes. So we wanted to give people the full understanding of what we created in a festival version.
Sure, absolutely. And as you quite rightly say, there are festivals, but also streaming services. I know Fox Docos have just launched their new channel, so to speak, and other streaming services are looking for product. And you're right too about perhaps having a 50-minute version or whatever for the ABC or SBS or whoever. So I can see a lot of currency in the documentary in terms of how it could roll out.
Yes, definitely. And you're right. Yeah, streaming, obviously, since COVID, a lot of films have had to go that way. And yes, we're part of host screenings. It doesn't necessarily have to be live. We want to be able to start the rollout with live festivals because, as I said, the idea is to bring community together. But we've also set up through Eventive to have host screenings. So that's the digital rights management platform. So at this stage, we're trying to, get it out to the grassroots community, core audiences to start with, and as you say, yes, if we can get it to other platforms, that'll be fantastic.
Absolutely, it's a really interesting story. Nick, I must ask you about your skills as a cinematographer, as filming wildlife such as the Lyrebird, and your involvement with any other films at the moment.
Well, interestingly enough, I've been working on filming lyrebirds this last year for it's a David Attenborough's Wonder of Song, which looks at song in the natural world, and it's because of COVID the production was shortened, and as a consequence of that, it's mostly library footage. So the idea is that they look at David Attenborough's old footage, so basically there've been old scene of him with some whales in the late 90s in the whale song, then some lemurs in Madagascar and they're howling, so it's different animals throughout the world, but they used the footage from that I did for Life of Birds, and then they got me to go out and shoot some more footage. So it's the only part of the show which has got some library footage with new footage tucked into it. But as such, it's not like this film. It only looks at the lyrebirds in one small segment of the film, similar to what Life of Birds did. But most recently I worked on a film about quolls, which is called Quoll Farm. And that was on the ABC in February. It's very popular. And that was it was my colleague. I live in Tasmania now. It was my colleague down in Tasmania, Simon Plowright, and so it was about his year of living with the quolls. So the quolls had taken over an old Bannet farmhouse, and we spent a year there with the quolls, filming them as they got up to various activities. There was a devil that lived under the house, and various possums that lived in the roof that they interacted with. But it was very similar to the way we filmed Message of the Lyrebird, except it was a commercial job, got paid for it. But I was out with the bush, in the bush with the animals for long periods of time, which is what I love doing. I don't really like going to a spot, staying there for a few days and getting a little sequence and going away again. The kind of filming I love doing is the filming like we did for Message of the Lyrebird, which is very immersive. And I've always wanted to be a filmmaker, when I was a wildlife filmmaker. When I was 16, I wrote to David Attenborough and asked him if he could employ me on his films once I left school. And he wrote back and he said, no, of course I don't employ anyone because I'm a presenter, not a filmmaker. So I can't really help you. Very nice letter that he hand wrote back to me from his house in London. And I keep that letter in my copy of Life of Birds, where he wrote, "Dear Nick, thank you for your hard work on the series." So I proved him wrong. He said he would never employ me, and he did.
What an interesting story. Okay, great stuff, Nick. And Mark, I must ask you, are you also planning or working on other projects at the moment?
We've got a project that's been in the pipeline for a couple of years called We Are, and it's more of it's nature and how humanity. It asks some of the big questions: who we are, where we're from, where we're going. And we did a lot of filming with traditional custodians and, all sorts of spiritual people. I think we've filmed up to about 24 different people now from all over the planet. And we went to a festival in Bali, which we collected quite a number of those people to interview. And it's more about the human identity than anything else. But the biggest project I've got on my plate at the moment is we've just taken custodianship of 22 acres of koala habitat. And yeah, we'd like to conserve the koala and everything else that's on that forested property. And so yeah, that's it's going to be a life project, that one, I think. Although the Lyrebird has taken me a quarter of the time I've been here on this earth. So but yeah, so that's the bigger one. That's also a feature, but that's probably going to be a couple of years away, I would say. We just obviously we can't do any filming at the moment, and but we do have, yeah, we've been in pre-production with that one for a couple of years, and yeah, that's definitely on the cards. And then whatever else comes up, I guess, whoever else wants to pay me to do some work.
And hopefully that will eventuate. Well, for both of you, of course, paid employment so much better than not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Except the Message of the Lyrebird is a beautiful film, and it's worth putting Mark's time into it. And if someone had paid us to do it, it wouldn't have been so beautiful. They would have wanted to be commercial, and they would have wanted to be, you know, in a certain way. And at least, you know, Mark's had the ability, in both of us, but Mark particularly, as the film, you know, the filmmaker, I'm more the sort of tradie on the film. He's had the ability to craft a really beautiful film, which people will love this film forever. They'll be watching it in 20, 30 years' time, if not longer, you know. And we wouldn't have been like that if it had been commissioned. It wouldn't have been such a beautiful film.
Yep, no, very fair point, because you could do it your way rather than being controlled by other forces that will want things in a particular way. So absolutely spot on. Look, it's been great talking to you both. The Message of the Lyrebird, look out for it. And we've been speaking to Mark Pearce, who's the producer-director, and Nick Hayward, who is the DOP for the film. Thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you, Peter, for having us.
Thanks, Peter. It's been a pleasure.
Always is, and we'll talk again soon, I'm sure. Okay.
Sure, well.
Thank you.
All the best. See you later. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Peter.